they've been. She said she was going to a friend's house with the kids, and that's the last thing I heard. And that was it. It was very vague, and it was very. I don't have no inclination where she is. Every friend that I've called that has a car seat that could have come and got her.
And you saw her yesterday morning?
Yeah, I saw her yesterday morning. She got back from the airport, and she has to be somewhere.
Losing time, I'm fading fast. I just wanna make it last. Try to let go of the past. I close my eyes, embrace the blast. Sleepless nights and headaches stack. Restlessness to hell and back. What's my purpose? What do I grab? A slippery surface, a heart attack. And sometimes you just gotta believe there's something that'll give you relief.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. It's November 2nd, around about a year ago now and 4 days. The plea deal was announced in the Chris Watts case. If you think about this year, how long ago was mid-August? This case was wrapped up incredibly quickly, not only from a legal point of view in terms of the entire legal apparatus, the court case and the legal aspect to it, but also the whole story. The whole story has sort of been dealt with and put to bed and put into a drawer in super quick time. What's amazing is how much material has come out and how quickly all of that material has also sort of been shelved. It's also the 12-year anniversary of the Amanda Knox case. It's amazing that that crime took place around about 24 hours after Halloween. What's also interesting is South Africa has just won the Rugby World Cup, and they also did the same 12 years ago and also against England. So it's I think they played against France, but they also beat England in that Rugby World Cup. And so as we go into today's episode, it's good to bear in mind what happened in the past, what barks and echoes reach to us from the font of history and from the distant and then not so distant past. And then one of the aspects of that is the dog narrative. That was the first thing I actually seized upon when I wrote the very first narrative in this case. Without any discovery being available, I certainly seized on the dog narrative. For me, it was pretty seminal when you sort of heard Watts talking, giving an interview, and then you heard the dogs barking behind him. And it seemed as though he was trying not to appear perturbed, but he had to have been concerned. He had to have been concerned that those barks were indicating that the dogs knew something. And of course the dogs did know something. At that point we didn't know how much they knew or how little they knew. But at the same time we also didn't know who we were dealing with. We didn't know the silver fox had a couple of tricks up his sleeve, and that he was quite a master himself at cleaning up certain things anyway after him. He was certainly good at cleaning up stains and things like that, and hiding things away and concealing. One does wonder if the dogs had gone into the scene a day earlier, what the alerts would have been like, and if they'd gone in Monday afternoon. That would have certainly been interesting. In any event, once again I want to thank the 5,000 subscribers. Thank you for your attention, thank you for your interest, thank you for your loyalty, thank you for your comments. Again, please like and share this video. This video has some connection to one I posted earlier on Gate, so you're welcome to listen to that one after this one. I'm not going to go into the discovery in a lot of detail here. I'm going to try, I know I said this the last time, but I'm going to try to keep this one short. I've kind of got things to do and I've got things to prepare for, so I kind of don't want to be here all day. It does take quite a while to sync the audio to pictures and to source the pictures. It also takes quite a long time to save big files and also to upload. So I'm going to try and keep this quite short, comparatively short. Before we get there, I've got a question for you guys just to test your knowledge of the case. A lot of us think we're experts by now. Of course, when we think we're experts, then we don't learn anything new. So it's always very good to have a bit of humility, even when we think we know better. So with that in mind, and again I'm referring to the distant past, how good is your long-term memory? How good is your short-term memory? How good is your memory? How good is your selective memory? How meticulous and systematic is your thinking and your focus? And one way to test that is with a relatively obscure question, and the question is, how many dogs are involved in this story? How many dogs are involved in this story? If you can answer that one correctly, then there's a follow-up question, and that is, do you know the names of all the dogs in the story? Okay, let's get going. In one of the later narratives in the Two-Face series, I compiled a exhaustive, complete cast of characters. Now, the difference between making a YouTube video and writing a blog post and sort of, just talking about this case is you think you're doing your due diligence. You think even when you're focusing on something that you are dealing with it thoroughly and carefully and properly. It's a little bit different when you write a book. When you write a book, you want to make sure that you have dotted every I and crossed every T. And while a lot of people will come back at you and say, well, you made a typo here and you made a grammar mistake there, I think what people don't realize when you write a book is it's extremely difficult putting together a narrative that is compelling. In other words, that's not boring. Number two, that makes sense. Number three, that's factually accurate. And number four, and it's probably the hardest part, where all of this holds together. So it's one thing telling a story, it's another thing where it actually holds together with a maximum amount of information. And so a good narrator, a good researcher, a good true crime expert will get as much information as they can possibly get their hands on and then kind of move forward. Another thing is when you're starting to address certain questions, for example, what happened when Shanann arrived home? Didn't Dieter bark when Shanann arrived home at 2 o'clock in the morning? When you're asking a question like that, you need to know things. You need to know the nature of the Dachshund dog. You need to know where these sort of dogs would normally be kept in the home. I've the benefit that I have a neighbor who actually has a Dachshund. I also lived in a house in Cape Town once upon a time where the neighbor also had a Dachshund that they left alone for extensive periods of time. This is stuff I've mentioned in the book, so I'm not going to deal with that too much, but just to come back to the complete cast of characters. So when this is quite far into the Two-Face series, when you have a chapter like that, just dealing with the complete cast of characters, you want to make sure you don't leave anyone out. And so in every section, whether it's FBI, CBI, law enforcement, lawyers for the prosecution, lawyers for the defense, extended family on the Watt side, extended family on the Rusek side, thrivers, and so on, you want to have as complete a list as possible. You want a definitive list. And so part of that definitive list is the dog handlers, and part of the definitive list of in terms of the dog handlers are the dogs, right? And you start to notice when you trying to compile this exhaustive list that, wow, I realized there was an extra dog here, and I realized, oh, that's the name of the dog. When you've got to make the list, you've got to go to the trouble to actually find out the dog's name, right? And it's that kind of attention to detail that distinguishes true crime rocket science from everybody else. So the answer is there are 4 dogs in the Chris Watts case, arguably 5. A 5th person did volunteer his services, but they weren't needed. But specifically, there were 4 dogs involved. Probably most of us saw 2 of them or 3 of them. Not sure how many of us saw all 4 of them or knew that there were 4. In any event, let's start with Dieter. Dieter's a dachshund, quite excitable dogs, and Dieter was obviously the family dog and the only survivor of the Watts family murders. What's amazing, again, from a narrative point of view, when you try to intuit the crime from Dieter's perspective, I'm talking about take it from Dieter's perspective. Where was he at 2 o'clock that morning? Where was he when Chris Watts loaded the bodies into the truck? Where was he when Watts left for the morning, right? Where was he throughout that morning? And then also, where was Dieter when Chris Watts arrived back, right? And we'll deal with that in a second, because we do know the answer to that question. Then the next dog is Cody, a trauma dog. Apparently it's also a cadaver dog, but I'm not terribly confident just about this particular dog. Although the discovery refers to Cody as a cadaver dog, I didn't really get that sense from the dog. A dog tends to be trained in a very basic way. A dog tends to be trained as a cadaver dog, in other words, only alerts to cadaver traces, and that's human cadaver traces, or it alerts to blood traces. Now, if you're going to say a trauma dog, what is that? Is a trauma dog one that alerts to blood traces, or is it both? So I don't really like the way that this was somewhat muddied in this particular case. And that brings us to Dax, the black German Shepherd. His handler was Jeff Hibbert. This dog appeared to be a cadaver dog, specifically. And then there was a 3rd dog, Scout, and once again, it's difficult to say whether the bloodhound was trained in, searching for trails or human remains detection. Personally, I would prefer a dog that is a specialist, one that only alerts to cadaver traces or one that only alerts to blood traces. I don't like the fact that in this particular case it seems like there are 2 dogs that are kind of a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. And this may explain why the results in this particular case are a little bit confused, a little bit muddled. There are certainly expert dogs, specialist dogs, that where you can have 2 dogs at the scene at the same time, one that alerts to cadaver traces and one that alerts to blood traces. And they're not necessarily the same thing. They can be, but they're not necessarily the same thing. When I say they can be, I'm saying the traces may be in the same spot, although not necessarily. It takes time for cadaver odor to form. It doesn't take necessarily that much time for blood traces to be deposited. And yeah, when you leave a blood trace behind, that's not going to become a cadaver trace. But you could have blood and cadaver traces in the same area. That can certainly happen. We know that the cadaver and blood dogs in the Madeleine McCann case were really key, and also in the Casey Anthony case. And one wonders if cadaver dogs had been brought into the Ramsey home early on, what they would have found. If they would have found cadaver traces in a room besides the basement. Okay, so when we review the footage of Shanann arriving home at 1:48, it's strange. Every time you look at that footage, you can almost see something else. It's almost as if you're looking into a void, and something in the void is looking back, especially at the very end of the clip. But I wonder whether Shanann had a bad feeling when she sort of entered the house. And what I mean is, wouldn't it have been normal for Dieter to sort of be there when she arrived? Wouldn't it have been normal for her to be greeted at the door by the dog? And there are various kind of arguments one can make in terms of the domestic arrangements. Would Shanann have wanted the dog not to wake up because it could have woken up the children? So would there have been instructions, or would Watts have known to sort of put the dog somewhere where he wouldn't have woken anybody up? We don't know what the everyday arrangements were of the dog. It wasn't something that was asked. It's hard to believe that the dog wasn't allowed sort of free roam of the house, but I think that did come up. Whether the dog would have free reign of the house. We know that when Chris Watts arrived home, he went straight. Once the officer came into the house, he went straight to the basement, and you could actually hear Dieter barking in the basement. And then the next thing you heard, Dieter right by the officer, sort of by his feet. He was out of sight, but you could certainly hear him barking loudly. So it sounded as if Dieter was sort of locked downstairs, and that he wasn't able to come up the stairs. Whether he was in a cage, we don't know, but what's interesting is when the officer and Nicholas sort of knocked on the window, did you hear a dog barking? Did they not see the dog? And so that certainly raises questions, and raises the question of where was Dieter, and could they hear him? Should they have heard him? I've already dealt with Nicole Atkinson saying that she went to the house to sort of, how can I put it? I think part of it was because they had already been there to look after Dieter, but part of it was also, I think, to check on Dieter, I guess. I don't think it was that as much, but it was certainly the fact that she went to the house is because she'd been going to the house every day while they were in North Carolina. When everyone was away in North Carolina, Nicole and Nicholas had been going to the house daily to dog sit, so they were familiar with the dog, and they were familiar with the house, and they were sort of used to gaining that sort of access. And that's why it's a little bit unfortunate that the dog narrative is somewhat missing. What were the normal movements of the dog? Where did they leave him? In other words, where did Nicole and Nicholas leave the dog when they weren't there? Where did they leave him? So let's start off by going through the cadaver dogs and the signals and alerts that they gave, starting with the images. And there were a couple of cases where you saw the dog on the outside porch, and the handler would sort of lift a cushion, and the dog was barking quite stridently. And dogs have different ways of alerting. Some dogs alert by barking, like a loud bark means a strong alert. A less loud bark is a not a strong alert. Whimpering is a weak alert, and so on. Other dogs will sit down and be completely quiet, and that will be their alert. So there are different kind of forms of signaling. In terms of Cody, there just seemed to be a lot of barking. Now it's difficult to say, was he barking because he knew something, or was he barking because he was excited? And that's the part that's kind of problematic with true crime and with these dogs, is sometimes it's both. Sometimes they're barking because they're excited, and sometimes they're barking because they have found something. If you followed Cody through the neighborhood, he also barked at times. Now, was it because he smelled something out there in the neighborhood? You might laugh at that, and you might say no, but the faculties of cadaver dogs are incredible. Like, they can literally, if you've been driving with a dog in your car, a cadaver dog can even sense traces of those cadaver traces on the highway. In other words, they can run down the road and sort of follow the scent along a road. And that actually happened in the Scott Peterson case, which is incredible. The dogs found a route sort of through the back country towards San Francisco Bay. They also picked up cadaver odor at the jetty, at the area where they launched the boats. And that's another thing. Cadaver dogs can even smell cadaver odor on water. So if you've buried a body in underwater, cadaver dogs can even tell that under some circumstances. So interestingly, even in the Scott Peterson case, both the bodies, when they eventually found, were actually found by dogs. They were found in terms of the route out of the neighborhood. In that way, that traces of Lacey were known, and they were also literally, the bodies were found by neighborhood dogs in San Francisco. Both cadavers, the cadaver of the fetus and of Lacey, which were a mile apart, were found by two different dogs. So you really shouldn't underestimate the incredible powers of, olfactory powers of these animals. I'm not going to go through it's fascinating to look at. I'm not going to go through I'm not going to follow the route of the dog through the house. I'm not going to do that for Cody or for Dax. I did do that in the narratives. I did sort of highlight what happened where and what looked quite suspicious where. What we do know is that the dogs arrived on the scene one day late, and that there was a smell of bleach when they arrived, and also that there was a little bit of difficulty in getting articles to scent from. And you had the officer enter the residence, Officer Lyons, I believe, and she was asking is there anything that you didn't touch that we can give to the dogs to smell? And then and that was when he went into the master bedroom bathroom, and he went to the laundry basket and he lifted up the jeans. Now that would have or should have been the best item to scent off, unless he'd washed it. But him doing that was basically saying, oh sorry, I've just contaminated this, you're not going to be able to use that. And then he sort of did something similar in the laundry room. And in the end, the officer got something off the shoes. I'm not 100% sure if it was the shoes that had been wet at the party or not, but some scent was gotten. But it may be that this already contaminated scent already put the dogs at a disadvantage. There is a moment where one of the dogs seemed to bark when it went into Bella's room. It's difficult what to make out of that. I personally don't think that the children died in their beds. but that alert does seem to indicate something. I should actually correct myself. That's not necessarily an alert. It's the dog barking. We don't actually know what the way is that the dog alerts. And in the Madeleine McCann case, you can quite clearly see when the dogs do alert. They sort of stand completely still, and the one will wag its tail, the other one will bark really, really loudly, like a piercing bark. In this case, it's not as clear what the alerting protocols are. And anyway, if we defer to the discovery on page 84, we see that Jane and her canine, which she stated was a cadaver dog, moved through the home. Jane explained that what type of sense Cody alerts to, and Jane mentioned several times that the dog alerted to areas where there may have been some sort of trauma or struggle, such as an argument. I don't know what to make of that. I mean, she says several times there'd been, possibly trauma or struggle, but where? Where would that have been? Be specific about it. And I think what's also extraordinarily difficult is if the people who are killed they live in the home anyway. So you can imagine over a period of time, the children lay in those carpets and played in those carpets, and Watts lay in the carpets himself and sweated in the carpets as well. Does that necessarily mean they're alerting to struggle, or they're alerting to just normal human traffic, right? That's sort of the difficulty we're dealing with, especially in this sort of home situation. And so what did appear to be some kind of alert, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but some kind of interest from the dog was at the bottom of the basement stairs. In some parts of the discovery it's not as clear, and it seems to be referring to the top of the basement stairs. In any event, on page 85, and this is a report by Officer Lyons, she refers to a track dog asked to enter because there had been some indication from the cadaver dog that a struggle or argument may have ensued. And that's when Jeff Hibbert and his black Labrador entered. We saw that dog showing interest in the unmade bed in the basement, and also an area just below the stairs. So we saw that. But what was problematic was you didn't see both dogs showing interest in exactly the same places. And so what is emphasized here is that Dax didn't show any trained final alerts. A trained final alert is basically absolute confirmation from the dog that somebody died. And so the law enforcement didn't have that. So on Tuesday morning and midday, law enforcement didn't know, they weren't able to confirm that anybody had died. And this is why Kessinger's testimony at this point is quite important, because when she spoke on the Wednesday and she said, well, we have had an affair, then law enforcement knew for a fact that he was lying and that he had motive, and also that there was reason to believe that those cadaver dog, the interest shown by them did point to something serious. To be honest, when I got hold of the discovery, I was expecting it to be quite a black and white situation where the cadaver dogs basically absolutely showed traces, and that the case was basically very open and shut. And I thought that was why Chris Watts was forced to confess. I'm talking about confess that he killed the children as well, because the cadaver dog alerts gave him no room to move. In the Madeleine McCann case, the Madeleine's parents were also faced with the very compelling evidence of the dogs. What do you say to this? And they really didn't have much to say. They didn't really have much of an answer. It was just, well, maybe the dogs are wrong, kind of thing. But it put them in a very difficult position, and I thought the same was going to happen with Chris Watts. So I was really surprised when the discovery came back, and it wasn't like there were no alerts, but the alerts were, as I say, kind of muddled. And this, we sort of know why, because there was a lot of cleaning going on that night. When I think in Cadle's book there's this talk about turning all the lights on and so on. It was to clean the house. That was why. That is why all the lights were on. It was to clean the house. Lighting also plays a role in the crime scene of Amanda Knox, where there are 2 lamps lying on the ground and there's a lot of wiping and cleaning going on there. In the Scott Peterson case, you also have a situation where absolutely no traces of Lacey were found in her home. Why? Because there was a heck of a lot of bleach used, and if you want to ruin the what's the word, neutralize the talents of these dogs, then bleach is the way to do it. You can imagine a dog that that is super sensitive to the slightest cadaver trace, is also super sensitive to the stinging, eye-watering smell of chlorine-based bleach. That's going to contaminate and interfere with what they're smelling. If they're smelling soap, it's gonna, they can't be honest and say, well, this is a definite sign of whatever odor, because their eyes are watering from the other chemicals that are at play. And bear in mind, this is a chemical case just like Scott Peterson. Scott Peterson worked with industrial chemicals. Arguably, Chris Watts and Shanann worked with chemicals every day. Shanann with powders and capsules and pills, and Chris Watts with petrochemicals. The contribution of Officer Lyons, even though the actual evidence or lack of that came from the dogs was disappointing, Officer Lyons alone kind of made up for it with incredible observations. It's almost as if, and I think I did the same thing when I wrote the first book, when you're intuiting the scene from the perspective almost like of an animal, where you're sniffing around and you at ground level and just at a very primal sort of level, then you notice things in a very detailed way. And this is why Officer Lyons was the only one who seemed to notice the vacuum lines in the carpet. She's looking at the crime scene through the dog in a way. She's kind of smelling the crime scene through the perspective of the dog smelling the clothing. She's wondering, as the dog is moving through and she's giving them scented items, she's wondering, I wonder what the dog is seeing. And so that is really activating her intuition and her imagination, and as a result we got incredible evidence from her. We got the evidence of the strong odors of the cleaning chemicals, the evidence of laundry and vacuuming, and then we also see that Lyons was also very aware that Watts looked uncomfortable, and that he seemed awkward, and that he seemed sort of awkward and not himself, but at the same time he seemed not concerned about his family. And so we got some of the best we got the best observations arguably from Officer Lyons of anybody on the scene. So just to quickly review, again, if they'd checked the crime scene a day earlier, the dogs may have come up with a lot more than they did. Why didn't Dieter bark when Shanann arrived at the front door? Why didn't she hear Dieter bark when she arrived at the front door? Was that normal? Nicole Atkinson could probably answer that. On the one hand, one can say they wouldn't have wanted to wake up the children. On the other hand, would Shanann have wanted Dieter downstairs, in the basement? It's difficult to know what the right answer is to that. The other aspect, of course, is in a premeditated murder, Watts wouldn't want the dog interfering with his attack, and certainly not barking in the middle of it. So he would have wanted the dog out of the way. But it would be interesting to know what Shanann would have wanted and expected. It does seem as though Dieter was in the basement based on when the officer arrived back. So for me, the biggest what the F in terms of the dogs, well, one of them is the fact that there was no clear cadaver traces. That really shocked me. I really thought it would be very, very clear. So that was surprising, and the pendulum then swung sort of in favor of Chris Watts, that he'd successfully gotten rid of so much evidence that there wasn't absolutely clear evidence that someone had died in his home. There was muddled evidence for sure. But I think that has been trumped, that has been trumped by the what the F that of Dietergate. In other words, where Nicole Kessinger arrived at the home the second time on July 14th, and according to her, she sort of followed Dieter around. She was sort of playing with the dog, I guess, and then followed him upstairs according to her story. And when she did, she sort of saw other photos of the family, and then this caused her to feel insecure, uncertain, and put her into kind of a crisis. She was like, why would you want to leave this? And Chris Watts had to demonstrate his commitment. He had to prove and show that he really meant to be with her, and that he was going to be with her, and all that kind of thing. And so a final observation to make is that one can say, why would Chris Watts kill his wife, his unborn child, and his eldest daughter and his younger daughter, but allow his dog to live? Why not kill Dieter as well? And that's kind of a very interesting question. One can say, well, he had nothing personal against the dog, but think about it in another way. The dog is a reminder of the family. The dog's also part of the family. Didn't he want to start a new life? But it's actually a very interesting question when you deal with it quite sensitively, and you sort of say, for whatever reason, Watts felt that he didn't want to take his family into his new life, but for whatever reason he felt Dieter was okay, right? He felt that Dieter, I guess in his frame of mind, hadn't done anything wrong. And so but there's another aspect to it as well, which is, was Dieter compatible with his new life? And what that kind of brings into is, what about Duke? Would Dieter have gotten on with Kessinger's dog? And one kind of has the impression that Watts was fairly close to the dog, and liked the dog, and maybe even loved the dog, and that he liked that aspect about Kessinger as well, the fact that she liked the dog too. Not only her dog, Duke, but that she liked his dog. Bear in mind, her interaction with Dieter is the only interaction she had with any other member of his family, and it was possibly positive. Maybe she liked Dieter. Maybe she thought Dieter was, it was something they had in common, that they kept dogs and they looked after dogs or something like that. So that's just something to bear in mind. So overall, I find the dog narrative is a very interesting aspect in a lot of true crime cases. It's often very much underrepresented, underreported, underappreciated, and certainly from the perspective of criminals, they tend to be a ace up the sleeve of law enforcement. In this case, you heard the dogs barking while Chris was talking. Did it change the outcome? It just put a little bit of extra pressure on him that otherwise wouldn't have been there. In any event, a lot of the detail in terms of this is covered in the Two-Face series. Please go and have a look at it. I've obviously hyperlinked to the discovery in the narrative on Kindle, and to where the dogs sort of alert in those videos. Please go and have a look at the Two-Face series. It's they are still the best reviewed and best ranked and rated books that are available at the moment. Silver Fox is the latest book, and there's also the Crime Rocket blogs, which are free. I will post one more What the F. I wonder whether you guys can guess what the 10th What the F will be in this series. Thank you for listening.
You mind if I look around? Go ahead. Go ahead. Thanks. Oh, you're fine. Go outside. Outside.